My sister stood in my cramped kitchen, adjusting her 3-carat ring. "Just stay away from the symposium, Emily," she said. "Preston's mother runs the hospital. Don't embarrass me." I nodded, holding my tongue. I didn't tell her the groundbreaking research she was about to present was actually mine. The smell of bleach and burnt coffee is something that never really washes out of your clothes. It settles into the fibers, right alongside the distinct, metallic odor of the centrifuge. I had spent the better part of 3 years in a windowless basement lab at Carmichael General, mapping the protein structures of aggressive neuroblastoma cells. My life was measured in micrometers, in failed assays, and in the blinking cursor on my data spreadsheets at 3 in the morning. My sister, Brittany, measured her life in entirely different metrics. We were only 14 months apart, but according to our mother, the gap might as well have been a chasm. Brittany was in public relations. Specifically, she was the newly appointed director of communications for the very hospital where I spent my days scrubbing petri dishes and begging for grant extensions. She had an office on the top floor with a view of the skyline. She wore tailored blazers that didn't have faint blue stains from reagent dyes. The contrast was never more obvious than at our parents' anniversary dinner. I arrived 20 minutes late, still wearing my damp trench coat from the rain, my hair pulled into a messy knot held together by a plastic binder clip. The dining room was already loud. My parents were pouring a second bottle of Merlot, and sitting at the head of the table was Preston. Preston was the vice president of operations at Carmichael General. He was also the son of Dr. Evelyn Carmichael, the hospital's CEO and chief of medicine. And as of that evening, he was Brittany's fiancé. "Look who finally decided to join the real world," my mother said, not looking up from slicing the roast. "Emily, please tell me you didn't wear those shoes into the house. They look like they've been in a biohazard bin." "Sorry, Mom," I said, slipping off my scuffed loafers and taking the empty seat next to the radiator. Brittany leaned across the table, her left hand strategically placed near her wineglass so the kitchen light caught the massive diamond on her ring finger. "We were just telling Mom and Dad about the wedding plans, Emily. Evelyn wants to host the reception at the country club. She's being so generous. Honestly, she treats me more like a daughter than a future daughter-in-law." "That's great, Britt," I murmured, serving myself some cold green beans. I was too exhausted to bite back. I had been up for 36 hours trying to stabilize a cell line before the weekend. Preston offered a tight, practiced smile. He always looked at me like I was a slightly confusing spreadsheet. "Brittany tells me you're still down in the basement under Dr. Weber. Doing. What is it? Cellular analytics?" "Targeted oncology markers," I corrected quietly. "We're actually on the verge of a breakthrough with a new surface receptor. If the clinical trials—" Right, Preston interrupted, already checking his phone under the table. "Important stuff. Just hard to get funding for things that don't have immediate PR value." Brittany laughed, a sharp, chiming sound. "That's what I keep telling her. You have to sell the science, Emily. Nobody cares about the math unless there's a story." After dinner, while our parents were clearing the plates and Preston was outside taking a call, I went to the kitchen sink to rinse my dishes. Brittany followed me in. The playful, glowing bride-to-be persona dropped the second the swinging door shut behind her. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "The hospital's annual symposium is next month." "I know," I said, squeezing detergent onto a sponge. "I submitted my abstract 2 weeks ago. Dr. Weber thinks I have a real shot at the keynote slot." Brittany exhaled a short, harsh breath. "That's the thing. I need you to stay away from it." I stopped scrubbing. "What?" "Don't play dumb, Emily. You know how important this is. Evelyn is retiring next year, and she's grooming Preston to take over the board. This symposium is Preston's first time directing the entire event. All the major donors will be there. The board of trustees, the press." "And that means I can't attend?" I asked, turning to face her. "I work there, Brittany. It's a research hospital. I'm a researcher." "You're a lab tech who wears binder clips in her hair and talks about cancer cells at dinner parties," she hissed, stepping closer. "You're awkward. You stumble over your words. You don't know how to network. Preston's mother already thinks my family is a little rough around the edges. I cannot have you up on a stage, stuttering through a slideshow, making me look bad by association." I stared at her. The sheer entitlement wasn't new, but the blatant cruelty still stung. "My research could actually save lives, Brittany. It's not about your wedding. Everything is about optics right now." she snapped back, tapping her manicured finger on the granite counter. Just stay in your lab. Don't submit the final paperwork. Preston's mother runs the hospital, Emily. If you push this, you'll just embarrass yourself, and I won't let you embarrass me. She turned on her heel and walked back into the dining room, leaving me alone with the running water and a sinking, heavy feeling in my chest. I thought about the hundreds of hours I'd spent at my microscope. I thought about the data that proved, definitively, that my approach worked. I decided right then that I wasn't backing down. I was going to present. Monday morning brought a hard, driving rain that mirrored my mood. I arrived at the lab at 6 a.m., determined to finalize my presentation deck. Dr. Weber, my principal investigator, had always been supportive, if a bit passive. He was an older man, coasting toward retirement, but he knew the value of the ALX9 receptor data. We were sitting on a gold mine that could revolutionize pediatric oncology treatments. I sat down at my desk, booted up my computer, and clicked the shortcut to the secure departmental server. An error message popped up. Access denied. Contact system administrator. I frowned, tapping the keyboard. I tried again. Same message. I logged into my hospital email to see if IT had scheduled maintenance. My inbox was empty, save for a single, automated message sent at 2:15 a.m. from the Office of Operations Preston's department. Subject: Project Reallocation, ALX9 Study. Body: Due to restructuring in the Research Communications Division, the ALX9 Oncology Project has been reclassified. Primary data handling and public-facing presentation rights have been transferred to the Department of Medical Communications for the upcoming annual symposium. Lab personnel are instructed to hand over all physical backups. A cold sweat broke out across my neck. I read the email 3 times, the words blurring together. Transferred to Medical Communications. That was Brittany's department. I didn't wait for the elevator. I sprinted up 4 flights of stairs to Dr. Weber's office. His door was half open, and he was packing textbooks into a cardboard box. Dr. Weber, I gasped, leaning against the doorframe to catch my breath. My server access. The email. What is going on? He paused, refusing to meet my eyes. He carefully placed a heavy medical dictionary into the box. Emily, shut the door, please. I closed it, my heart hammering against my ribs. I tried to stop it, he said, his voice low and defeated. I sat in Preston Carmichael's office for an hour on Friday evening, but it came down from Evelyn herself. The board wants a massive PR push for the symposium. They need a face for the breakthrough. Someone polished. Someone who can speak to the donors in a way that generates immediate capital. So they're letting communications handle the press release? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. That's fine. I can give them a summary, but I'm presenting the actual data, right? I'm listed as lead author. Dr. Weber finally looked at me. He looked 10 years older than he had the previous week. You're not listed at all anymore, Emily. Preston refiled the internal paperwork. They are listing the communications department as the primary driver of the clinical translation phase. Your sister is presenting the keynote. Brittany doesn't even know what a peptide is, I shouted, the shock finally cracking into anger. She can't read a scatter plot. She's a PR rep. That is my intellectual property. It's my life. It's Carmichael General's intellectual property, Dr. Weber corrected gently. You signed the standard employee contract, Emily. Whatever you produce on their equipment belongs to them. And Evelyn Carmichael has decided that her future daughter-in-law is the perfect, radiant face to present this hospital-wide achievement. It solidifies Brittany's place in the family, and it guarantees Preston looks like a genius executive for orchestrating it. They're stealing it, I whispered, the reality crashing down on me. Brittany told me to stay away from the symposium so I wouldn't find out. I am so sorry, Emily, he said. If you fight this, Preston will fire you. You'll lose your lab access permanently. Keep your head down. Let them have the dog and pony show. We still get to do the actual science. I left his office in a daze. The hallway felt entirely too bright, the fluorescent lights buzzing aggressively above me. That evening, I drove to my parents' house. I needed to pick up some mail that had been delivered there, but mostly, I just needed to be somewhere familiar. My parents weren't home, they were out at a cake tasting event with Brittany and Preston. The house was quiet. I walked into the dining room, sorting through the stack of envelopes on the table. Next to the mail was a towering pile of engagement gifts, wrapped in silver and white paper. And sitting right on top of a Tiffany box was a glossy, spiral-bound presentation deck. The cover page featured the Carmichael General logo. The title read, Targeting the ALX9 Receptor, A New Era in Oncology. Below it, in bold, elegant font, presented by Brittany Miller, Director of Communications, supervised by Preston Carmichael, VP of Operations. My hands shook as I opened the cover. I flipped through the heavy stock paper. It wasn't a summary. It wasn't a PR spin. It was my exact slide deck. They had taken my charts, my graphs, my microscopic imaging. They had even kept the specific Excel color coding I used, a custom shade of teal I always chose, because it was easier on my astigmatism. I turned to slide 14. Last week, when I was exhausted, I had accidentally misspelled efficacy as efficacy on a subheader. I had meant to change it before submitting. There it was, printed in high-gloss ink. Efficacy. Brittany hadn't just taken the credit, she hadn't even bothered to proofread the work she was stealing. She was going to stand up in front of 500 people, including some of the top medical minds in the state, and present my late nights, my tears, and my brilliance as a neat little accessory to her engagement ring. I closed the binder. The anger that had been simmering in my chest all day suddenly stopped boiling. It turned cold. It turned sharp. Dr. Weber told me to keep my head down. My sister told me to stay away. I picked up my phone, opened my personal email, and began to type a message to the hospital's independent ethics committee. I wasn't going to stay away. I was going to secure a front row seat. Bureaucracy at Carmichael General was a slow, lumbering beast. The internal ethics committee operated on a 6-month backlog, and filing a formal grievance would require routing the paperwork directly through Preston's office. I didn't have 6 months. I had 5 days. Instead of waiting for the hospital administration to investigate itself, I looked at the bottom line. The ALX9 research was primarily underwritten by a massive federal grant managed by the Genesis Medical Foundation. The foundation's chief liaison, Dr. Thomas Wright, was a notoriously uncompromising biochemist. He was also scheduled to be the guest of honor at the symposium, sitting in the front row to evaluate the hospital's return on the foundation's investment. I spent Tuesday and Wednesday in the lab, ignoring the sympathetic, nervous glances from Dr. Weber. I didn't touch the microscopes. I sat at my terminal and ran forensic extractions on my own user profile. Because we worked with HIPAA-compliant, highly secure medical data, every single keystroke on the departmental server was logged, time-stamped, and tied to an individual employee badge number. I pulled the raw server access logs. I downloaded the metadata of every single microscopic image file used in the presentation, proving they were captured months before the communications department even knew the project existed. I generated cryptographic hashes of my original, unedited abstract submission. Finally, I printed the automated 2:15 a.m. email from Preston's office, the one that explicitly detailed the reallocation of my data to my sister. I placed the stack of documents, nearly 200 pages of irrefutable, hard data, into a thick manila envelope. On Thursday evening, I drove to the downtown plaza where Dr. Wright was staying. I paid the hotel concierge $50 to hand-deliver the package directly to his room, along with a handwritten note clipped to the front cover. Dr. Wright. Enclosed is the complete, unedited methodology for the ALX9 receptor trials. Review the data on page 42. During tomorrow's keynote, please ask the presenter to explain the ischemic cascade mitigation. Friday morning arrived with a crisp, biting chill. The symposium was held in the grand ballroom of the city's most expensive hotel, a sprawling space draped in heavy velvet curtains and illuminated by cascading crystal chandeliers. The contrast to my windowless basement lab was jarring. The air smelled of expensive floral arrangements, roasted espresso, and the sharp tang of floor wax. I did not wear my usual scrubs or my damp trench coat. I had spent a significant portion of my meager savings the day before on a sharp, charcoal gray tailored suit. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, tight twist. No plastic binder clips. I looked like I belonged in the room. The lobby was already crowded with hospital executives, wealthy donors in designer wear, and visiting academics holding champagne flutes of sparkling water. I stood near a marble pillar, watching the crowd. My parents arrived at 10 o'clock. They were practically vibrating with pride. My mother wore a new silk blouse, clinging to my father's arm as they navigated the sea of attendees. They didn't see me in the shadows. They were entirely focused on the center of the room, where Brittany was holding court. She looked radiant. She wore a pristine white dress suit, a deliberate, subtle nod to her impending wedding, and her hair was perfectly styled in loose waves. She was laughing, touching the arms of elderly board members, and gesturing gracefully with the hand that bore Preston's ring. Preston stood beside her, projecting the image of a seasoned executive, nodding gravely at whatever the donors were saying. A few feet away stood Dr. Evelyn Carmichael. The CEO was a formidable woman with iron-gray hair and a gaze that could freeze water. She watched her son and her future daughter-in-law with a look of smug, calculated satisfaction. This was her legacy secured. A brilliant son and a charismatic, supposedly brilliant new addition to the family brand. I waited until the chime sounded, signaling the beginning of the keynote address. The crowd began filtering into the ballroom, taking their seats in the rows of plush chairs. I waited until the very last moment to enter, slipping through the heavy oak doors just as the lights began to dim. I bypassed the reserved family section at the front and took a seat in the very last row, directly next to the aisle microphone, designated for the audience Q&A. The projector hummed to life, casting a massive, glowing blue square onto the screen above the stage. The Carmichael General logo faded into view. Evelyn took the podium first. Her voice was amplified, smooth and authoritative. She spoke for 10 minutes about the future of medicine, about innovation, and about the hospital's commitment to pioneering new frontiers. But true innovation requires fresh voices, Evelyn said, gripping the edges of the wooden lectern. It requires communicators who can bridge the gap between the laboratory and the living room. Today, I am incredibly proud to introduce a presentation that represents the pinnacle of our hospital's recent achievements. Presenting the clinical translation of the ALX9 trials, our Director of Communications, Brittany Miller. The applause was thunderous. My parents stood up in the third row, clapping furiously. Brittany walked onto the stage, adjusting the lapel microphone. She smiled, a bright, practiced expression that reached all the way to the back of the room. She clicked the remote in her hand, and my title slide appeared on the screen behind her. "Thank you, Dr. Carmichael," Brittany said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. Medicine is, at its core, a story of resilience. Today, I want to share a story about how we are rewriting the narrative of pediatric oncology. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, and watched my sister present my life's work. Brittany was, objectively speaking, an excellent public speaker. She knew exactly how to pace her breathing, how to make eye contact with different quadrants of the room, and how to use her hands to emphasize a point without looking frantic. For the first 15 minutes, the presentation was flawless. She clicked through the introductory slides, explaining the broad, basic concepts of cellular mutation using the heavily sanitized PR language she had clearly rehearsed. She talked about synergy and patient-forward paradigms and holistic cellular mapping. The donors were captivated. The executives nodded along, but I kept my eyes on the front row, specifically on a man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Dr. Thomas Wright was not nodding. He was sitting completely still, a thick manila envelope resting on his knees. Brittany reached the core data segment. The slides transitioned from broad stock photos of smiling doctors to the dense, complex scatter plots and microscopic imaging I had spent years compiling. This was where the cracks began to show. She read the text on the slides verbatim. She didn't stumble over the words, but she spoke with the careful, deliberate cadence of someone reading a foreign language phonetically. There was no inflection in her voice during the critical data points. She glossed over a massive spike in the control group data, a spike that proved the entire thesis because she simply didn't understand what the graph meant. Then, slide 14 appeared. The teal-colored subheader flashed onto the massive screen. Phase 2. Testing the efficacy of peptide introduction. I saw a few academics in the middle rows tilt their heads at the spelling error. Brittany didn't even notice. She pointed her laser pointer right at the misspelled word, delivering her memorized lines about trial progression. She wrapped up the presentation with a soaring, emotional conclusion about saving lives and building a brighter future. The ballroom erupted into applause again. Brittany beamed, waving lightly to the crowd. Preston walked onto the stage, joining her at the podium, placing a supportive hand on the small of her back. "Thank you, Brittany, for that illuminating overview," Preston said smoothly into the microphone. "We now have about 10 minutes for questions from our esteemed colleagues. Please approach the aisle microphones if you have an inquiry." The room rustled as people shifted in their seats. For a long moment, nobody stood. People were generally hesitant to be the first to speak at these high-profile events. Dr. Thomas Wright stood up. The murmurs in the room quieted immediately. As the liaison for the Genesis Foundation, his presence commanded absolute authority. He walked slowly to the front microphone, tapping the manila envelope against his leg. "Miss Miller," Dr. Wright began, his voice dry and echoing through the ballroom speakers. "A very polished presentation. Truly." "Thank you, Dr. Wright," Brittany said, her smile widening. "We worked very hard to make the data accessible." "Yes, accessible," he repeated, adjusting his glasses. "In your methodology, you highlight the rapid binding of the ALX9 receptor. It's a remarkable breakthrough. However, the slides gloss over the initial stabilization phase. Could you elaborate on how you mitigated the ischemic cascade during the cellular breakdown? As the lead driver of this clinical translation, I'm sure you can walk us through your specific trial and error process." The silence in the grand ballroom was sudden and absolute. Brittany froze. Her bright smile turned rigid, her eyes widening slightly as the words washed over her. She gripped the edges of the wooden podium. Her acrylic nails made a faint clicking sound against the microphone base. She looked down at her presenter notes, flipping a page, but there was nothing there to save her. "I hadn't included notes on the ischemic cascade in the presentation deck because it was foundational knowledge any researcher in the field would already possess." She looked up, panic flashing in her eyes, and glanced desperately at Preston. Preston stepped closer to the microphone, his polished executive facade tightening. "Dr. Wright, we appreciate the granular inquiry. However, as this presentation is designed as a high-level, translational overview for our donor network, the specific biochemical mechanics are detailed in the supplementary files." "I did not ask you, Preston," Dr. Wright cut in, his tone dropping the polite pretense. "The Genesis Foundation is underwriting this clinical trial to the tune of $4 million. We do not fund high-level overviews. We fund science." "I want to hear the presenter explain the fundamental mechanism of the discovery she just claimed." Brittany leaned toward the microphone, her face flushed red. The cascade was mitigated through standard stabilization protocols. We optimized the synergy of the reagents to ensure efficacy." It was a word salad, a meaningless string of corporate buzzwords attempting to answer a deeply technical biochemistry question. A collective, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the rows of visiting academics. I stood up. I stepped into the aisle, grabbed the microphone stand next to my seat, and clicked the power button. "Standard protocols failed entirely during the first 14 assays," I said. My voice boomed out over the speakers, cutting through the murmurs like a scalpel. Hundreds of heads turned to look at the back of the room. I saw my mother gasp, bringing a hand to her mouth. My father half stood from his chair. On stage, Evelyn Carmichael's face drained of all color. Brittany stared at me, sheer terror replacing the panic. "The cellular breakdown was too rapid," I continued, speaking clearly and deliberately, holding Dr. Wright's gaze. "To mitigate the ischemic cascade, it required the development of a synthetic peptide sequence specifically, a modified ligand that bonded to the cell membrane before the oxygen deprivation could trigger apoptosis. That stabilization allowed the ALX9 receptor to remain visible under the spectrograph." Dr. Wright nodded slowly, a grim, satisfied smile appearing on his face. "Fascinating and highly specific. And at what molarity was this peptide introduced exactly?" 0.05 millimolar, I answered immediately. "Any higher, and the cells degraded due to toxicity. Any lower, and the binding affinity was insufficient." "Thank you," Dr. Wright said. He turned his attention back to the stage. "Miss Miller, is this accurate?" Brittany opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She was shaking visibly. Preston grabbed the podium microphone. "Security," he snapped, his voice echoing loudly. "Please remove the technician from the back of the room. She is disrupting the event." I didn't move. "The presentation you just watched is my exact slide deck," I said, my voice steady, projecting over Preston's demands. completed last Thursday at 2 a.m. on the basement lab servers, including the typographical error on slide 14. Director Carmichael transferred the project to the PR department on Friday, stripped my name from the primary authorship, and instructed me to stay away from this symposium so I wouldn't disrupt his mother's legacy building. Uproar broke out. Several reporters in the back rows began typing furiously on their phones. Donors were whispering aggressively to one another. 2 hotel security guards appeared at the back doors, looking uncertainly at me and then at the stage. "This is slander," Evelyn Carmichael yelled, finally standing up from her front row seat, her composure entirely shattered. "This is a disgruntled, low-level employee making baseless accusations. Escort her out." Dr. Wright raised his hand, and the sheer authority of the gesture silenced the room again. He held up the thick manila envelope I had sent him. "It is not baseless, Evelyn," Dr. Wright said, his voice cold and precise. "I hold in my hand the encrypted server logs, the metadata trails, and the time-stamped access records provided by the actual researcher. Carmichael General has essentially stolen intellectual property to parade a PR representative in front of major donors. This is a profound breach of academic and institutional ethics." He turned to face the entire ballroom. "Effective immediately," Dr. Wright announced. "The Genesis Foundation is freezing all grant funding to this institution. We will be launching a full, independent audit of Carmichael General's research and operations departments by Monday morning." The fallout was instantaneous. Executives scrambled out of their seats. Evelyn Carmichael collapsed back into her chair, pressing her fingers to her temples as the reality of the frozen funding and the end of her career set in. Preston glared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred, his entire corporate future dissolving in front of him. And Brittany, my polished, perfect sister, couldn't handle the stares of 500 people realizing she was a fraud. She abandoned the podium, turned, and practically ran off the side of the stage, her white dress suit disappearing behind the heavy velvet curtains. I turned off my microphone. I didn't look at my parents. I didn't need to. I had spent 3 years in the shadows, letting them dictate my worth. I walked down the center aisle, the crowd parting for me, and pushed through the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the bright, quiet lobby. The air felt incredibly clear. What an explosive finale. Emily finally stepped out of the basement and proved her brilliance in front of the entire medical board, taking down Brittany's web of lies and Preston's corrupt administration in one brilliant move. The truth always comes to light. If you loved this satisfying story of justice and holding entitled people accountable, smash that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible daily stories just like this one.